Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's always a pleasure to be in Kerala. You know, I keep on saying that there is an eternal connection between Kerala and my home state, Manipur. If you're not aware, this sobriquet, the nickname of my state is called Little Paradise. So quite obviously, Little Paradise have to have some relationship with God's own country, I suppose. That's why we have commonality in football, in theater, in films. Both these states are pretty well known across the country. And I think this crisis has, I believe, brought us together more closer. This is, I think, my fourth visit to this state in my life. Recently, I was there in Kochi for an international film festival where, incidentally, one of my film was premiered. I also into filmmaking before I joined. I'm into too many things in my life, I suppose. And it so happened that after winning the Lok Sabha election, as per the new UGC rule, I'm still continue to be a teacher in JNU, and, which is in my bone marrow. It's my primary identity. What I shall do it briefly is just to lay out some issues for the rest of the country and for my audience to understand what is the issue that we face. I know it's a long history, and I'm aware that many of the people in this country is not aware of what happened in the Northeast. That's also primarily because of the exclusion that I mentioned in my first speech in Parliament, which has been part of my writing, academic writing or otherwise. Northeast is being included in India through a process of exclusion. And I have written this borrowing from an Italian thinker. It is inclusion by exclusion. That's the process through which Manipur or the Northeast become part of India. It is excluded from Indian history in just the way as the European would have excluded Africa and Asia and the rest of the world as, in Hegelian sense, people without history. And they were anthropological subjects. It was only after Battle of Plassey, for instance, that India finds its place in the history of the world within quote, dominated by the European lens as a part of history. In a very similar sense, you will see that I know as an academic for the last 31 years of my life, that you will find Northeast as a subject matter of anthropology, not as a part of history. So it is excluded from NCERT textbook and so on. That's peculiarly what the post-colonial scholar says. There is a continuity between the colonial and the post-colonial in South Asia. And a classic example is what the Northeast is to India. It is on the same principles that I asked a very prominent journalist as he was interviewing me, and I said, just answer me first. I said, had this crisis been in places like the so-called mainstream, UP, Bihar, or Bengal, or anywhere, do you think that it would have been allowed to go on like this? He shook his head. And I said, therein lies the answer. You must ask why it was allowed, or it has been allowed, for so long in that part of the world. So in this sense, like many issues in this country, what happened in the Northeast and Manipur in particular in the present crisis is a legacy issue. It has a lot to do with the practices and ideas injected by the colonial forces. Just as we know how census was introduced in this part of the world and classifications of people and how identities get reified based on those colonial practices. We are all familiar with that. What happened in Manipur is, unfortunately, there was a forced topographical and categories were injected by the colonial British. We should know that right from Kashmir to Uttarakhand to Nepal and Sikkim, Arunachal Pradesh to Nagaland to Manipur till Mizoram, and all the way to Arakan Ranges and even Andaman Nicobar Island, was created through a collision of the Indian plate and the Eurasia plate, sometimes like 50 million years ago. That's the elevation, we call it Himalayan regions. So Manipur is part of the Himalayan ranges. What the Britishers did was that there is a large central valley in the middle of the state, which is roughly around 8% of the total area of the state. This is where the largest community to which I belong, the Meitei, reside majorly. And around 92% of the total area is an up highland, which is where various tribes are settled. And this dynamics had a particular way or form of life where they interacted, they relate with each other in many ways, like most South Asian communities. It was through a particular classificatory scheme. They were seen as if they are discrete, opaque boundary identities. That's how the colonial practices have done in South Asia. The same thing happened in Manipur. What they described was that those people in the Central Valley, they call it civilized and civilization, and those people in the surrounding hills are savages and naked tribes. They forget that in their forms of life, as well-known scholars like Sudipto Kaviraj and others will remind us, they have a relationship in this country. It's a fuzzy community. We all have relationship. They marry each other, they go to war sometime together, they will fight with each other at times. But it was created as if these are two different sets of people. One called civilized. It's a typical European way of looking at the Mediterranean region as a civilized people, and the Nordic people as the savages, barbarians, and so on. That kind of classification was injected by the Britishers, particularly around 19th century. And they further consolidate once they took over Manipur. In the 20th century, they introduced laws, and they started treating these two sets of people as two different sets of people through different legal regimes. So they have created two sets of subjects. And that particular identity was internalized. And on that basis, they began to look at each other in the similar fashions, that as if they are different, they are unrelated, as if they cannot have a common goal. That's a kind of a thing, if you take a little larger perspective, that's the same thing that many scholars will tell you about the Hindus and Muslims. Let's remember that communalism, as many scholars will remind you, was a product of the colonial practices and processes. In a very similar sense, what happened in Manipur is a legacy issue in the same sense. It is a kind of a schism which was manufactured by the British. They complemented this division of the population in terms of a topographical false mapping. You think about it, how many of you will think that Nainital and Dehradun are two different places? They are part of the Shivalik region of the Himalayan ranges. Dehradun is briefly around 640 meters above sea level, and Nainital is around 2,000. They are part of the Himalayan ranges. Mark my word again, 640 meters. Dehradun is a hill station. Nainital is a hill station with 2,000 meters. Imphal is 800 meters above sea level, higher than Dehradun, and it is treated as if it is like a plain. And Churachampur, the hub of the conflict where this tribal group reside, is barely 900 meters, a difference of 100 meters. But in the topographical mapping, they think that it is the same relationship like Allahabad would have with Nainital, or Guwahati, which is 50 meters above sea level, with Kohima, the then Naga Hills, which is around 1,500 meters. They have falsely mapped out what is essentially a part of a mountainous region as a hill and the plain. So it complemented this one, and this trouble has continued. That's why they said hills should be separated, valleys should be separated, forgetting that this is topographically and ecologically a compact state, intimately tied geographical formation with interrelated communities. To think of it, what you called Kuki tribes, their language, according to linguistic classification, is part of the Kuki-Chin linguistic family, of which my language, Manipuri, the first Indo-Mongoloid language to be recognized in the 8th schedule of the Constitution, is also part of the Kuki-Chin groups. So it is a schism which was manufactured. So that is a kind of a colonial legacy. What happened is in the post-colonial period, what they have done is that Indian state its practices, instead of reversing these colonial categories, reinforces the two sets of communities. One was classified as scheduled tribe and the other as non-scheduled tribes. That my community is a non-scheduled tribe, general category. The other is a tribe. Then Christianity is spread among these ST groups, majorly in the mid-20th century. And traditionally, those people in the Central Valley, there are a lot of valleys in Manipur, don't get confused, but it is, I'm talking about the Central Valley in the middle. They are part of what we call it Manipuri Vaishnavite. We are quite like the Japanese in some sense because you follow your actual ritual and thought processes. Your institutions are a mixture of, just like the Japanese, between the traditional Shinto religion and Buddhism. Meitei's religious practices are majorly part of the larger, what you can call it, Vaishnavite tradition and the pre-Vaishnavite religious belief. We practice both of them. I'm wearing one of them. This is our demi-king god, which is the protector of the polis, the state. So what I'm saying is that not only that, colonial practice continued in the post-colonial period, classifying one as ST, another as non-ST. And then again, they introduced laws in 1960s, and they classified the upland as hills and the Central Valley as plain. Interestingly, in Nagaland, which is also part of the mountainous range, there is a place called Dimapur, which is their commercial hub, which is part of the extension of the Indo-Gangetic plain called Brahmaputra Valley, which is considered to be part of a hill state. And Imphal, the capital city, is supposed to be a plain, as if it is like Lucknow, Allahabad, and Guwahati. Interestingly, in 1965, in National Development Councils, there was a move, the decision was taken in 1964, to take care of the hill regions development in National Development Council in 1964. Decision was taken. A report was submitted in 1965. And there they have this, all India, they classify, two groups of states with hill areas. One, they call it hill state. Another, they call it state with hill areas. Kerala is considered to be a state with hill areas. So does Assam, Madhya Pradesh, and so on. UP, before Uttarakhand was separated. Manipur was classified, along with Nagaland and in Kashmir and all of them, as part of the hill state. But within it, both legally and institutionally and conceptually, you think that there is a plain and there is a hill and two different kinds of people. It is this worldview and practices and institutions that is implicated in the present crisis. It was aggravated by what can be called practices of the post-colonial Indian state practices, which primarily I'll mention only one because I don't have time, counterinsurgency. Manipur was a kingdom. We know that in Indian history, following the negotiation in the London on Round Table and the Simon Commission report, an administrative reform was carried out and the government of India 1935 was passed. We assume it to be a federal state, combining what used to be called Indian state or princely state on the one side and the British India, which is directly ruled by the British. They came together, but it did not work out. 1937 election was held by excluding this princely state. But Sardar Patel and V.P. Menon tried to integrate these princely states under the same Act 1935. An instrument of annexation was carried out. Manipur was one of those states. Out of the 600 states, they have listed less than 100 states as a gun salute state. Manipur was an 11 gun salute state. Kashmir and Hyderabad were 21 gun salute state. Cochin and Travancore was also one of those gun salute states. So Manipur came, but unlike other princely states, Manipur had a constitution of its own. The king was reduced to a constitutional monarch. But the government of India bulldozed those constitutions and the assemblies. That's the dissatisfaction led to the armed movement in Manipur. As a part of countering that, Indian state did was to prop up these small tribal armed groups to fight against these armed groups. So it is a part of that violence that continue. And the present crisis is part of the same problem. Many of the so-called Sioux groups of these cookies have never fought with the Indian state. They have never fired a single bullet, so to speak, against Indian armed forces. Yet these are armed groups. The government of India maintained a relationship and suspension operations. You must understand why some people demand the scrapping of these Sioux. It is these practices that they was burst into flame for two reasons. I think I'll just cut short with this. Because of these tradition of separate and practices various kinds of ideas, there is a movement for Jalingam, which is supposed to be an independent country comprising of what they call it Kuki-Chin groups in Bangladesh and Myanmar, which is a Chin state, neighboring Mizoram. So it encompasses a large group of these areas, and there is an ethno-nationalist mobilization. And part of the population in Manipur's southern part is implicated in that movement. So many of them imagine Kuki state within India as some sort of a halfway home to maintain their own autonomy within these structures. So they will side with this side, Indian state one time, another side, this side. So that gets complicated. And the Indian state continued this move. Many observers believe this crisis is also related to controlling and neutralizing political armed groups who have been fighting against the Indian state. This particular crisis, they said, is part of that, to mobilize forces to state. This particular crisis, they said, is part of that, to mobilize forces to create alternative civil society forces. In fact, it has been done now. We have armed groups who have never heard of before. There are groups which are much more active today, and that neutralizes and balances some of the traditional forces. So this is part of the crisis that we have. Two more issues. The Golden Triangle, notorious for its drug and poppy, has UN reports suggested that it has shifted its gear towards the eastern side, out of Laos, Thailand, and Myanmar. Myanmar became the hub of that one. It has spillover in Manipur. That is why bordering Myanmar, you have massive forests and hill areas, you have poppy cultivations. So there are an international drug dimensions to the crisis, and we are pretty sure that local people are also involved, but I suspect that those people will be minor player of this game. But when I say minor, remember that when you're dealing with opiums like this, even a minor would mean thousands of crores of rupees. And according to some observers, when I had a conversation with them, the economy of drug in Manipur runs in 60,000 crores, much bigger than that of the state's own budget. Lastly, but not the least, there is also competitive democratic politics. You try to prop up yourself as leader of the Meitei community, one as leader of the Kuki community, and BJP played game. What they did was that they asked these Sioux groups in 2017, 2022, it's all in public domain, you Google it and you'll see. These Sioux groups, these armed Kuki groups, supported them in elections. In promise, they were supposedly said that they will fulfill their political demand of a separate administration or something of that kind, which is openly came out because one of these groups, in an affidavit submitted to the court, written very clearly that I met so-and-so of the BJP and they promised us all of these things. On the other hand, they prop up some people from my community as a defender and the savior of the Meiteis. And it is this polarizations played by BJP government has aggravated the situation. And I suspect that the government of India's silence, which I call it its complicity in the whole crisis, please remember, in post-colonial Indian history, you have never heard of 60,000 people languishing in wretched condition in camps. I have seen them. It's horrifying.